Hello guys and welcome. In this lecture we will learn about some of the most common terms used in cybersecurity, such as infosec, cybersecurity, asset, vulnerability, threat, attack, and IT risk. After that we will apply these terms to some real-life scenarios. Welcome to the general definition section. In this section we will go over some of the most common terms used in cybersecurity. So let's dive in. First off, we have infosec, or information security. Infosec is the practice of protecting information. This usually involves protecting or at least reducing the risk of unauthorized access, disclosure, modification, corruption, or deletion of information. To make it more concrete, let's think of a few examples where infosec would be needed. First off, think of an application that contains your medical records. Only you and your doctor should be able to see those medical records. So, your data should be protected against unauthorized access. Another example would be your private messages and emails. We would definitely not want them to be leaked publicly on the internet. And finally, think of your bank account. That account should be protected against modification, corruption, or deletion. You wouldn't want to wake up with less money in your account or without an account altogether. Next, we have cybersecurity, also known as computer security or information technology security. Cybersecurity is part of infosec and is the practice of protecting IT systems against digital attacks. It basically means protecting computers, servers, mobile devices, electronic systems, networks, and data from malicious attacks. These attacks can have as purpose the theft or damage of electronic data, such as personal data, as well as software and hardware. Other common purposes are to disrupt and/or misdirect the services provided by IT systems. For example, attackers can target a bank and make online banking unavailable. Or, in another scenario, an attacker would misdirect us to a malicious website where we would be tricked into giving our credit details to hackers. In the previous slide, we learned that cybersecurity means protecting components such as data, software, and hardware that support information-related activities. In InfoSec, such a component is called an asset. Assets can be devices such as a PC, a server, or a smartphone. Assets can also be software, for example a website, an online shop, an online banking app, a car infotainment system, an operating system such as Windows, Linux, or Mac, or just a regular application. Finally, assets can also be information, such as a database with customer information, emails, personal messages, and so on. Now that we learned what an asset is, let's have a look at vulnerability. A vulnerability is a weakness in an asset. Usually, an attacker uses one or more vulnerabilities to commit their attack. Some common vulnerability examples are using outdated software and libraries, bugs, and misconfigurations of IT systems. Next term is threat. In computer security, a threat is the potential negative action or event caused by exploiting a vulnerability. Threats can be intentional or unintentional. A few examples of intentional threats are malware, phishing, hackers, or even an employee that is angry with the company. For unintentional threats, some examples would be natural events such as an earthquake, a flood, or a hurricane, or a technical failure such as a hardware or software failure. Another term commonly used is attack. An attack is a deliberate assault on an IT system with malicious purpose. You might see some similarities between a threat and an attack, so let's compare them. An attack is a deliberate action against a target with the intention of doing harm, while a threat is the potential for the occurrence of an attack. Since an attack is a deliberate action, it's always intentional, while a threat can be intentional or unintentional. Last but not least, an attack is an attempt to cause damage, while a threat has the potential to cause damage. The final term that we'll discuss in this section is IT risk. IT risk is the potential that a given threat will exploit vulnerabilities of an asset and cause harm. The IT risk is basically a combination of impact and likelihood. To better understand the IT risk, let's have a look at an IT risk matrix. On the horizontal axis, we have the impact, which goes from negligible on the left side to severe on the right side. On the vertical axis, we have likelihood going from very unlikely at the bottom to very likely at the top. Let's take two scenarios to better understand risk. In this first scenario, we have a website which is hosted on multiple data centers. And for one of the data centers, there is a very small chance that an earthquake can happen in that area. Because of that, the likelihood of the threat is very unlikely. And since the website is hosted on multiple data centers, the impact is negligible. Even if one of the data centers goes down, the website would still work. Based on the information, the risk is very low. For the second scenario, let's think of an online shop. Due to a bug, when you log in on the online shop, you have the rights of an admin, and you can access data from other customers. In this case, likelihood is very likely because all users have admin rights, and the impact is severe because everyone can access data of other customers. This results in a critical risk. Now that we have knowledge of the terms used in cybersecurity, let's use what we've learned in a couple of examples. In the first scenario, we have an online shop which contains private information such as contact details of customers. Besides that, we have Alice, the owner of the online shop, who uses insecure credentials, such as admin for username and password. And finally, we have Eve, the hacker, who tries to obtain private information using combinations of commonly known credentials. Let's map the terms used today to this scenario. First, we have the online shop, which is an asset. The database containing the details of the customers can also be considered an asset. Then, we have the vulnerability, which in this case is the use of insecure credentials. Next, the threat, which in this case is information disclosure by exploiting the vulnerability. And then we have the attack, which in this case is Eve's attempt to log in as administrator using common insecure credential combinations. Finally, we have the risk. As we discussed, risk is a combination of likelihood and impact. In this case, the likelihood is likely, since this is a simple attack, and the impact is severe, because private information would be leaked to Eve the hacker. This results in a critical risk. In our second scenario, we again have an online shop which contains private information such as contact details of customers. In this case, the online shop is hosted on an unpatched server. Besides that, we have Bob, a regular user just buying stuff online. On the other side, we have again Eve the hacker, who tries to obtain confidential information using vulnerabilities from the unpatched server. This might seem a bit abstract, so let's see a more concrete example. Let me introduce Heartbleed. Heartbleed was a bug in the OpenSSL library, in the Heartbeat implementation. The Heartbeat is used to check that the connection between the server and the client is still active. Due to improper input validation, this bug could result into leaking confidential information from the server. The bug was first introduced in 2012, but was only detected in April 2014. As of July 2019, over 90,000 devices were still vulnerable to Heartbleed. To better understand this, we have here an oversimplified example of how Heartbeat works and how Heartbleed works. From time to time, the client wants to check that the connection with the server is still open, and will send a message to the server and wait for a reply. On the left, we have the normal usage, in which the client would say something like, "Hey server, are you still there? Send me this 3-letter word back if you are there." And then it would give a 3-letter word such as cat. Then the server would reply with the message cat. Now the client knows that the connection with the server is still open. On the right, we have the malicious usage using the Heartbleed bug. Similarly to the normal usage, the malicious client would send a message to the server. The client would say something like, "Hey server, are you still there? Send me this 128-letter word back if you are there." And then it would just send a 3-letter word such as cat. Due to improper input validation, the server would send back the 3-letter word followed by 128 letters filled with whatever else is after that word in the memory of the server. The malicious client could get an answer such as cat followed by some secret key stored on the server or confidential information about users such as their credentials or personal details. Now that we have a concrete example with Heartbleed, we will update the second scenario. So, we have an online shop which is using OpenSSL version 1.0.1. This version of OpenSSL is vulnerable to Heartbleed. As we discussed previously, the online shop contains private information such as details of customers. Besides that, on the left side we have Bob, the regular user just buying stuff online, and on the right side we have Eve, the hacker,
who tries to obtain the confidential information by exploiting Heartbleed. Once again, let's map the terms learned today to this scenario. First, we have the online shop, which is an asset. The database containing the details of the customer is also an asset. Next, let's see the vulnerability. In this case, is the usage of OpenSSL version 1.0.1. Then we have the threat, which is again information disclosure by exploiting the vulnerability, in this case Heartbleed. Now let's have a look at the attack, which in this case is Eve's attempt to obtain confidential information using Heartbleed. Finally, we'll have a look at the risk. And again, we will have a look first at the likelihood, then the impact, and finally we will calculate the risk. In this case, the likelihood is likely, since this is a relatively simple attack, and the impact is severe, because private information would be leaked to Eve the hacker. Because of this, we have a critical risk. To recap, in this section we learned the definitions of InfoSec, Cybersecurity, Asset, Vulnerability, Threat, Attack, IT Risk, and how to map these terms to scenarios. With that, we conclude this section. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask us. See you soon in the next section.
Hello guys and welcome. In this lecture we'll have a look at the CI model, which is widely used in cybersecurity, and we'll discuss each element of the CI model with examples. Also, we'll see some common ways that are used to enforce each element of the model.
Welcome to the Introduction to CIA lecture. To better define different types of security threats and how to protect against them, a model called CIA has been created. The CIA model is also known as the CIA triad. What does CIA stand for? And no, in this case it doesn't stand for Central Intelligence Agency. In cybersecurity, CIA stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. In the next slides, we'll go in more detail regarding each element. Let's start with confidentiality. Confidentiality is the property that information is available only to authorized individuals, entities, or processes. Confidentiality basically refers to protecting information from being accessed by unauthorized parties. A failure to maintain confidentiality is commonly known as a breach. Most of the time, once there is a breach, it cannot be remedied. For example, if private emails are leaked publicly online, we have a breach, and unauthorized parties have already accessed and read the information. We cannot do anything to make the unauthorized people unread the emails they already read. Let's see a few examples where confidentiality is important. Let's start with health and insurance. For example, your medical records are private and only authorized people should be able to access them, such as for example you and your doctor. Another domain is financial services. Your transactions and balances should be private. Also, you would not want your credit card to be made public. Yet another example is messaging and social media. Your messages, emails, and social media should be private. Only you and the people that you want to share the information with should have access to that information. And finally, confidentiality is important in everyday use. Data that you store on your personal devices, such as smartphone or laptop, is confidential. This data should only be accessible to you even if your device is stolen. Now that we understood what confidentiality is, let's have a look at some common ways to ensure it. First, we can do this by encrypting sensitive files. For example, your hard drive should be encrypted, so even in the event that your device is stolen, the data is not accessible to anyone else. Another example can be encrypting data stored online, such as in the cloud, so that it's only available to authorized parties. Another way to ensure confidentiality is to communicate over secure channels. This can apply to messaging tools, for example. Ideally, you should use apps like Signal or WhatsApp that provide end-to-end encryption. End-to-end encryption means that the message is encrypted by the sender and only the receiver can decrypt it. This way, the message can travel safely without the fear of eavesdropping. Next, we have data access management. This basically means providing access to the data only to authorized parties. For example, let's take a personal computer that has multiple users. In order to make sure that my personal data is not accessible to other users, I must set the permission to access my files only to myself. No other user should be able to access my files. Finally, in order to safeguard confidentiality, devices and documents should be secured. This basically translates to not leaving your device or documents unattended in a public space. Also, you should never ever keep your passwords written in spaces that are accessible by others, such as for example your work desk. You can have the most secure passwords in the world, but if you have them written on sticky notes on your desk, it's all for nothing. Before we move on, please note that multiple methods discussed in this slide can be used at the same time to guarantee confidentiality. After confidentiality, let's discuss about integrity. Integrity refers to ensuring authenticity of information. This basically means that information is not altered and that the source of the information is genuine. Again, let's have a look at a few examples where integrity is important. Let's start with health and insurance. Think of an app that contains your medical records. You definitely don't want your medical records to be unreliable and have different data each time you open your app. You want to know that your data is correct and filled in by a trusted source, such as, for example, your doctor. Next example is financial services. Your bank account must not be altered by anyone. Nobody wants to have an empty account out of the blue. Another domain where integrity is important is automotive. For example, the speedometer of the car should be trusted, so it must always be accurate. You don't want to get a speeding fine just because your speedometer was inaccurate. Yet another example can be messaging and social media. Integrity must be enforced for posts and messages on social media. Otherwise, people could impersonate you and write or change messages on your behalf. Last but not least, integrity is important in everyday use. Whenever we surf on the web, for example reading news on our favorite news site or watching some movie on a streaming service, we need to know that the news site or streaming service do not contain altered content and that the information is genuine. Now that we know what integrity is, let's see some ways it can be ensured. One way is by using checksums. A checksum is a value that is computed based on data. This value is used to detect if errors have been introduced during the transmission or storage of the data. For example, messenger applications can use checksums to validate whether the message received contains errors or not. Another, more powerful way to enforce integrity is to use digital signature. A digital signature is a mathematical algorithm that is used to validate the authenticity and integrity of a message. So, for example, each message that is being sent in a messenger can be digitally signed, guaranteeing that it has been sent by a specific person and that its content is genuine. Next, we can use backups and redundancies to make sure that our precious information maintains integrity. Think of your personal data stored on your PC. If the storage has a hardware failure or the device gets stolen, all your data will be gone. But if you have a backup, you can easily restore the lost data. Another example can be a website, such as an online forum. The server on which the forum is hosted can fail at some point due to a hardware failure, risking to corrupt and/or lose the data. To protect against this, frequent backups can be done. Also, adding extra servers that host the online forum can help mitigate the risk of losing data. A version control system is a system that contains the current as well as previous versions of files, documents, or programs, and can be used to track changes done to the aforementioned files, documents, or programs. Last but not least, file permissions and access control can help ensure integrity. Basically, this means making sure that only parties that should modify or delete the data are able to do so. For example, let's imagine an online school schedule shared on Google Drive. The content of the school schedule should be accessible to everyone, both students and teachers, but should only be modified by the teachers. So, the teachers should give permission to view the file to everyone, but permission to edit only to the teachers. Before we move on, please note that multiple methods discussed in this slide can be used in conjunction to guarantee integrity of information. Until now, we covered confidentiality and integrity. It's now time to have a look at the last element of the CIA triad, availability. Availability means that information is accessible by authorized parties whenever desired. This applies to all IT systems, from all the services that we use online, such as, for example, video streaming platforms, online banking, social media platforms, and websites in general, to the usage of our own laptop or smartphone. All these services should be available to their users whenever the users demand it. Let's have a look at a few ways in which we can ensure availability. First, we have redundancy. We already discussed a bit about it when we looked at ways to ensure integrity. Similarly, redundancy could also be used to ensure availability. Nowadays, most services use redundancy to guarantee availability. For example, a streaming platform can have multiple instances deployed on separate servers so that if one of them goes down, the service is not impacted. For example, a streaming platform can have multiple instances deployed on separate servers. So, in the case that one of the servers goes down, the service is not impacted. Also, since one server cannot serve unlimited customers, hosting the service on multiple servers can ensure availability even when a large amount of users are using the service at the same time. Next, we have backup, which goes hand in hand with redundancy. Having data stored in multiple places can help guarantee availability. To continue with the streaming example, having a movie backed up and stored on multiple servers can allow the movie to be streamed even when one of the servers is down due to, for example, a hardware failure. Last but not least is cycle management. All hardware will eventually fail. Because of that, we should plan the replacement of older hardware, which can make the infrastructure more reliable and provide improved availability. The same lifecycle management can be applied to software, replacing older software with newer software. To recap, in this lecture we learned what the CIA triad is, and for each of its elements, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, we had a closer look and learned how we can ensure them. With that, we conclude this lecture. As always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask us. See you soon in the next one.